Well, hello and welcome. I'm David Pudwill. Some people call me Mr. Regulatory. Today, I want to talk about some recent FDA history over the past several years, and talk a little about some legislative changes, some things that the executive branch has tried to do, as well as recent interactions that FDA has had with the courts. FDA, as one of the administrative agencies, is controlled by the executive. What I learned during my time at FDA is that there actually seemed to be more of an impact when Congress changed hands. When Congress changed hands, oftentimes a different group of people would be bringing senior leadership from FDA in to hold them accountable. And this is something that would actually change the behavior of some of the people in leadership at FDA, even if those leaders didn't change, their decision making and their actions within FDA itself would actually change. And we saw this at both FDA and HHS when Congress changed hands during the time that I was at FDA. So here we can see section 3060 and some details that were clarified here regarding the regulation of medical devices and certain decision support software. And we can see here specifically the term device as defined in section 201H shall not include a software function that is intended for administrative support, for maintaining or encouraging a healthy lifestyle, to serve as electronic patient records, or for transferring, storing, or converting formats or displaying clinical laboratory tests or other device data. This was put into law in 2017. We'd been working on this for several years prior to this legislation being enacted. And here we can see some details that were put out in a Federal Register notice, a guidance that FDA put out in September of 2019, as well as some details released in 2021 regarding specific changes. If we scroll down, we can see the specific types of devices that were affected. And if we actually look at the ECFR, we can actually look at the notation of the changes that were made for medical image storage devices based on the plain reading of the text from 3060 are no longer devices. We can see that this remains a class 1 device that's exempt from pre-market notification. We can also see medical image communications device is here. As I noted, there are a couple other regulations as well that are affected. You can really see here with some of the changes that were made to align with 3060. From my perspective, this doesn't actually align with 3060, and you have some continued overreach by FDA, basically ignoring the direction from Congress to take certain actions here. We can see here some additional language about picture archiving and communications system, and the language here was changed to medical image management. Here we have some additional notes that came out around the same time, actually a couple days earlier here from FDA, and this was related to the withdrawal of proposed exemptions for various products. We can see here as we scroll down some specific language here about section 1003D that provides that the secretary shall be responsible for executing the FD&C Act through the FDA commissioner. And the January 15th, 2021 notice, FDA said this was clearly an action executing the FD&C Act, and that this should have been executed through the FDA commissioner. So this is FDA in 2021 looking to establish themselves as more of an independent regulatory agency, somewhat outside the purview of HHS, despite the fact that here we see that The FD&C Act provides that the Secretary shall be responsible for executing the FD&C Act. They specifically include the language here through the FDA Commissioner in this attempt to establish some level of independence of the FDA Commissioner from the HHS Secretary. I would say that's a particularly concerning precedent in terms of this coming out in a Federal Register notice. Is something that the new administration should be aware of when they're making changes specifically related to FDA. We can see some repeal of HHS rules on guidance enforcement and adjudication procedures. This is related to executive orders. We can see here some of the executive orders issued in October of 2019, and these were procedural rules that were issued in December of 2020 and January of 2021. We can see here that these are being rolled back. On January 20th, 2021, President Biden revoked both of these executive orders. We can see that FDA, in these cases we've looked at, has set themselves somewhat independent from the legislative branch and any oversight by Congress, which is concerning. They've also set themselves up as outside of and somewhat separate from the chain of command within the executive branch in terms of some of the language they've put into that Federal Register notice we looked at. Here we can see a recent case, and there are others, but one of the most high-profile cases is regarding mifepristone, a drug that the U.S. Food and Drug Administration approved in 2000 as safe and effective for terminating early pregnancies. This is sort of an interesting statement that something could be safe and effective while also terminating early pregnancies. This was an issue in this specific case. One of the things at issue was the way that FDA went about taking the actions that they did. Fundamentally, it would be important from my perspective to maintain the ability of the courts to come in and have something to say about the way in which FDA goes about conducting its business. But as we see here, the Supreme Court, while the lower courts ruled in favor of the plaintiffs in this case, we can see that the Supreme Court decided their case in June of 2024 based on standing of the plaintiffs. And so they effectively punted the case. And there's a little bit of a write-up here from kff.org. There's another write-up here from Epstein, Becker, and Green that provides context on these specific cases and what's at issue. It's important not to get swept up in what's being reported in the news. I would say it's important to think about this case in terms of the independence of FDA. Even before the Supreme Court had ruled, FDA had taken certain actions to establish their independence from judicial oversight. We can see with the Chevron case as well that came out from this Supreme Court recently, there is a pushback in terms of Chevron deference to the regulatory agencies. So that is going to somewhat restrain FDA and some of the things that they've been looking to do recently around LDTs and other rules they have proposed. This specific case is an interesting study in terms of the FDA and their position when it comes to the courts, and some concerning precedent in terms of the court's deference to FDA in areas where the courts should be exercising some degree of oversight. So it's important from my perspective for FDA to be held accountable by both the executive branch and the legislative branch. And I also think that the judiciary has a role to play in all of this. What we've seen in some of these items that I've discussed here in this video are just some concerning precedents over the course of the last 10 years or so, a little bit less than that actually, where FDA has been making moves from my perspective to establish themselves as an independent regulatory agency, or at least taking some steps in those kinds of directions. Some of the maneuvers that FDA has made, along with HHS, are definitely some things that the new administration, when they're coming in and looking to make some changes, definitely some things that they should be considering when thinking about how to go about making some of those changes and try to avoid the missteps of the first Trump administration when they were looking to roll back some of these various regulations. Well, that's what I have for you in today's video. I hope you found it informative and useful, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye for now.